And then the worst snake of all is malevolence. And I think that's technically correct, because one of the things that you view, for example, when you're looking at post-traumatic stress disorder, is that it's almost always the case that someone who suffers from post-traumatic stress disorder, which you might think of as a real life reincarnation of the fall, is that people encounter something malevolent and it breaks them, because it's the worst thing to understand. It's like suffering is one thing, man, that's bad enough. Vulnerability and suffering, that's bad enough. But to encounter someone who wishes that upon you and will work to bring it about, that's a whole different category of horrible. Especially when it also reflects something back to you about yourself. Because if someone else can do that to you, and they're human, that means that you partake of the same essence. Strangely enough, that's actually the cure to some degree to post-traumatic stress disorder. It's like if you've been victimized, you're naive and you've been victimized. The way out of that is to no longer be naive and to no longer be victimized. And that means that you see this reflected in the Harry Potter idea, for example, that the reason that Harry Potter can withstand Voldemort is because he's got a piece of him, right? He's been touched by it. And the way that you keep the psychopaths at bay is to develop the inner psychopath so that you know one when you see one, right? And then, but that's a voluntary thing. It's like a set of tools that you have at your disposal, which is full knowledge of evil. And that does, Nietzsche said, if you look into an abyss for too long, you risk having the abyss gaze back into you, right? The idea is that if you look at something monstrous, you have a tendency to turn into a monster. And people are often very afraid of looking at monstrous things exactly for that reason. And then the question is, well, should you turn into a monster? And the answer to that is, yes, you should. But you should do it voluntarily and not accidentally. And you should do it with the good in mind rather than falling prey to it by possession, essentially, because that's the alternative. And how does it possess you? That's easy. Your suffering makes you bitter. Your bitterness makes you resentful. Your resentful makes you vengeful. And once you're on that road, you go down that a little bit farther, man. Well, you end up fantasizing in your basement about shooting up the local high school and then killing yourself, right? Because that's sort of the ultimate end of that line of pathological reasoning. Being should be eradicated because of its intrinsic evil, and I'm exactly the person to do it. And I'll cap it off with an indication of my own lack of work just to hammer the point home, right? And if I can garner a little post-posthumous fame along the way, well, that'll satisfy my primordial primate dominance hierarchy imaginings too, at least in fantasy. So, you know, it's the full package if you want to go down that route. And of course, people don't like to think about that sort of thing, and it's no bloody wonder. But without the capability for mayhem, you're a potential victim to mayhem. So you need your sword. It should be sheathed, but you need to have it. And it's very frequently the case. If you treat someone with post-traumatic stress disorder, there's two things you have to do. You have to help them develop a very articulated philosophy of evil, because otherwise their brain bothers them over and over and over. Why were you so naive? How did you become victimized? Why were you such a sucker? These are good questions. You don't want to have that happen to you again. You don't want to be exploited twice. Okay, so your eyes have to open up. We know the price of that from the Egyptian myth, right? You come into contact with Seth. What happens? Even if you're a god, you lose an eye. It's no joke, man. It's no joke. And then the cure for that is the movement down into the underworld and the revitalization of the Father. That's the identification with the force that created culture, right? And that then there's you and that together. Then you can withstand malevolence. Maybe you can withstand tragedy and malevolence. And then that's the whole secret, right? Because that's what you want in life. You need to be able to withstand tragedy, and you need to be able to withstand malevolence, because those are the forces that are always working against you. And so this is associated with the Jungian idea of incorporation of the shadow, right? You have to be, we know this, God, we know how predators work with regards to children even. If you're a pedophilic predator and you're looking at a landscape of children, the child that you're going to go after is the one that's timid and won't fight back. You pick your victim. And predatory people in general are exactly like that, man. Because they're predators. They're not going to attack someone who's going to fight back. In fact, the issue is likely not to even come up. They're going to be looking for someone, one way or another, that cannot conceptualize what they are. And then, perfect. It's an open season, man. It's open season. And so if you're treating someone with post-traumatic stress disorder, first, they need an introduction to the philosophy of malevolence, and second, they have to learn to become dangerous, because that's the only way out. What's the alternative? They get these recurrent thoughts about their vulnerability in the face of malevolence and their own naivety, because by definition, if someone psychopathic has exploited you, you're too naive. It's a definitional issue. You can say, well, that's no fault of mine. How the hell could I be prepared? Fair enough, man. Perfectly reasonable objection. Doesn't solve your problem, because it's an eternal problem. If you concentrate solely on your career, you can get a long way in your career. And I would say that that's a strategy that a minority of men preferentially do. That's all they do. They work like 70, 80 hours a week. They go flat out on their career. They're staking everything on the small probability of exceptional status in a narrow domain. But it's hard on them. They don't have a life. It's very difficult for them to have a family. They don't know how to take any leisure activity. Like, they get very one-dimensional. Now, it may be that unidimensionality is the price you have to pay to be exceptional at one thing, right? Because if you're going to be something like a genius level mathematician and you want to do that or a scientist, say, it's like, you're in your lab all the time, you're working 70 hours a week or 80 hours a week, you're smart, you're dedicated, you're unidimensional, and that's how you get to beat all the other people who are doing that. It's the only way. But the problem is you don't get a life. Now, if you love being a scientist and you have that kind of focus of mind, well, first of all, you're a rare person, and second, you're going to pay for it. But fine, more power to you. But it's a risky business to do that. You sacrifice a lot for it. And I would say most often, if you're speaking about having a healthy life, that isn't what you do. You spread yourself out more. So, you have a family, you have some things that you do outside of work that are meaningful to you and useful. You have a network of friends. Those 3 things alone, or 4 things alone, are plenty to keep you well oriented. And then if one of those things collapses, everything doesn't go. Now, the price you pay for that is the more you strive to optimize that balance, the less likely you are to be fantastically successful at any single one of them. But you might have a very, if you consider your life as a whole, that might be a winning strategy. One of the things Carl Jung said, I really liked this. He thought that men went after perfection and women went after wholeness. So they're different value, they're different, there's something different at the top of the value hierarchy. So perfection would be stake it all on one thing and look for radical success. Not that all men do that, because they don't, but we're talking about extremes, at least with regards to the men that do that. The wholeness idea is more like, well, I want one thing in my life to be 150%, or I want 5 things in my life to be 80%. Well, there's a lot more richness in a life where you have 5 things operating at 80%, but you're not operating at any of them at 150%. So, and I really believe this because I've watched men and women go through their careers now for a long period of time. And one of the things there's lots of things that produce this. But one of the things that I've noticed is that mostly women in their 30s bail out of unidimensional careers. They won't do them. They won't put in the 80 hours a week that they would have to put in order to dominate that particular area. And it isn't, the reason that they won't do it is because they decide it's not worth it. And no wonder, because why would that be worth it? You have to ask yourself that. It's like, well, you want to be an outstanding scientist. It's like, okay, really, that's what you want? Because that means that's what you do. Because you're competing with other people. They're smart, they're hardworking, and if you want to be at the top, you have to be smarter and work harder than any of them. And working hard means working long hours. It also means working diligently, but in the final analysis, it's also an additive issue. If I'm smart and hardworking and I can crank out for 70 hours a week, and you do it for 30, it's like, in 2 years, I'm so far ahead of you, you will never, ever catch up. So, anyways. And I think maybe part of the reason too that women are oriented that way more than men, I think there's 2 reasons. One is socioeconomic status does not make women more attractive on the mating market, but it does make men more attractive. And the second is women's time frame is compressed, right? Because guys can always say, well, I'll have kids later. And they can say that till they're like 80. Whereas women, it's like, no way, man, you got to get it together by the time you're, let's say 40, but really probably by 35, but definitely by 40, because otherwise it ain't happening. And that's bloody dreadful. Like the most unhappy people you ever see, no. No. One of the common routes to extreme unhappiness is to want children and not have them. I wouldn't recommend that. You know, you see couples who are in their 30s. 1 couple in 3 over the age of 30 has fertility problems. That's defined as inability to conceive after 1 year of trying. 1 in 3. That's worth thinking about, because people are very, very unhappy if they want to have kids and then they can't. Man, you're in the medical mill for 10 years if that's what happens to you.